Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about the ancient Greek historians. Fellas, Roger probably knew personally. We are talking about the ancient Greek historians today, and my plans to revisit the ancient Greek historians. I probably won't actually be able to do this until next year, but I'm thinking about it now because for a long, long time, I've been interested in ancient history. The ancient history of the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and other cultures in the Mediterranean. It's just an interest of mine, a great interest. And this interest has led me to go to Rome and go to Athens and see what I could see. And there are some great things to see in Athens and in Rome. They're great historical sites as well as some fantastic museums and just some wonderful things you can see if you're interested in this kind of stuff, which I very much am. And I've missed ancient history since I've done this channel. I've been focusing on many other things. But I was thinking about this the other day when I was moving some books around, and I came across this set of books. This is The Greek Historians, which was published by Random House in 1942. And it's a very nice two-volume set of four of the five great Greek ancient historians. This set used to be owned by Miss Beeler, who inscribed this book on November 14th, 1942. She was from Berkeley, Miss Beeler. And I ended up with her books. And this very nice set of books reprints the histories of Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Arrian. So four of the five great ancient Greek historians. And this made me think, I've got to go back to this stuff. I've got to reread these historians because this is just fascinating stuff. I most certainly will not read the translations in this two-volume set, nice though these books are. For one thing, I think out of all the histories in here, there's only one map, and you need more than that when you're reading the ancient Greek historians. And so I'm going to be reading other editions, but this is certainly the set of books that made me think about this and made me think about returning to the ancient Greek historians. And after I read them, I will move on to the ancient Roman historians, of course. But the historians I have in mind, there are five of them that I'm going to be rereading. One is Herodotus, who lived in Halicarnassus, which is in Turkey. He lived approximately from 484 to 425 BC. And then there's Thucydides, the second great Greek historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. He lived from approximately 460 to 400 BC. And then there's Xenophon, who came after Thucydides. He lived, from approximately 430 to 355 BC. Thucydides and Xenophon were both Athenian. Then there was Arrian, who wrote about Alexander the Great, and most of what we know about Alexander the Great we get from Arrian. Now he lived much later. He lived from 86 AD to 160 AD, and he was Greek, but by this time Greece was part of the Roman Empire. He was Nicomedian. He was from Nicomedia. Then the final historian on the list, and one that was not included in that set of books, is Polybius, who lived from 200 BC to 118 BC. He was from Megalopolis in Arcadia, and he was an active member of the Achaean League, who became a captive of Rome, a well-treated and interested captive, who became good friends with some important Romans, and his history is about the rise of Rome and how Rome became the great power that it became. And it's really, really interesting. And he was Greek, so he was one of the five great Greek ancient historians. So those are the histories that I'll be reading. I will probably, almost certainly, read before these historians. I will go back to Homer and read these before I read the historians. Homer is very much a writer of mythology. He does not write history. Homer, he did not write history. These are not histories, but they are foundational in Greek literature, and they are referred to very often in the histories of the Greek writers. Everybody knew Homer, and so that seems a good enough excuse for me to go back and reread Homer. And I will probably read these editions of Homer. These are the Penguin editions of Homer that were translated by E.V. Rue. And they happen to be my favorite. They are not the best translations of Homer, but they are my favorite, probably because these are the ones I read first. And Rue's translation of the Odyssey was actually the very first Penguin classic ever published. Homer is wonderful, of course, and like I said, tremendously important and influential on all Greek literature. And so it seems to make sense to me to reread the Iliad and the Odyssey and then move on to the historians, which is what I'm going to do. And of course, the first great Western historian was Herodotus. So that's where I'm going to start, with Herodotus. I will revisit the histories of Herodotus once again. This is a magnificent book. It also happens to be my favorite book of all time. So, of course, I'm looking forward to reading it once again. And this edition of it is undoubtedly the edition that I will read, because it's the landmark Herodotus. And this is a series of books edited by Robert B. Strassler, who is an independent scholar. And this set of books is wonderful. So if I have the histories, whatever history I'm going to read, whatever historian I'm going to read, if there's a landmark edition of that historian, then I'm going to read it. And we start off with the histories of Herodotus, which tell the story of the Persian War and the events leading up to the Persian Wars and all the different cultures that were involved in the Persian Wars. And there were a lot. It's a very extensive book that tells you more than just the history. There are also myths and legends woven throughout this, because Herodotus, he realized that most of his readers, who were going to be Greeks, would not know all about the cultures of the Egyptians or the Scythians or the Persians. And so he goes and tells you all about those cultures and their myths and their legends, as well as their history. And a lot of their legends were mixed up in history. You know, it was kind of hard to tease out what was history and what was legend at this time. And so he gives you all the information. He'll give you information whether he believes it or not. If he has two versions of one story, he'll give you both versions and just say, hey, you decide which version you think is more likely. He was a fascinating guy, Herodotus, and a tremendously entertaining writer. He seemed so interested in so many things. Very chatty writer. And so you get this very entertaining, fascinating look at the ancient world, as well as these earth-shaking events that happened in the Greek world with the invasion of the Persians, and how the Greeks had to come together to fight off the Persians and maintain their freedom. It's a fascinating book. And so I'm very much looking forward to reading this once again. I love Herodotus, so it'll be great to read Herodotus again. And like I said, this edition is fascinating. It's got wonderful illustrations along with the text. But more importantly, the maps are tremendously important. There are so many places mentioned in these ancient histories. Many of these places no longer exist, or the names have been changed. And so it's helpful to have a lot of maps. And this series of books has a lot of maps. Every few pages you'll have maps that'll detail everything that's mentioned in the text. So any city, any river, there's going to be a map close by with those locations noted on the map, and so it's tremendously helpful, as well as just a ton of notes. You know, this was written well over 2,000 years ago by a fellow who lived in a very different culture, writing to his contemporary audience. And so, yeah, there could be plenty of things you don't know about the ancient Greek world. And so it's helpful to have a lot of notes just to help you along with that. It's great. So, yeah, Herodotus. I'm looking forward to reading Herodotus again. That'll be followed by Thucydides, who was the second great Greek historian, who was writing about the Peloponnesian War, which was a war between Greeks. So at this time, at the time of Herodotus, for example, the Greeks were independent city-states, basically, that were united by a common culture. And they had colonies that went out, and they colonized all over the Mediterranean. So there were Greek cities everywhere in the Mediterranean. And eventually, these cities formed up into two great powers. You had Sparta and their allies, and you had Athens. Athens became an empire, basically, and they had very different cultures. They were all Greek, but their cultures had some sharp differences. And eventually, they did go to war, Athens and Sparta, and all of their allies became involved in one way or another. And it became a great world war, basically. Persia became involved. It was an incredibly destructive, brutal conflict. And Thucydides, who wrote the history of this war, was involved in this war. He took part. And eventually he was banished by the Athenians for failing in a mission. And he traveled to Sparta. And so he was able to see both sides of the conflict and talk to a lot of people who were involved. And he wrote this really interesting history. It's a different type of history that you'll find in Herodotus. It's often cited as being a more scientific history. It's great, and it's full of scenes and moments that are just unforgettable, because it pulls you into that time, and it makes you realize that this is real stuff experienced by real people. There is no mythology mixed up in Thucydides' history. There are no gods there are no gods that are creating any kind of problems. These are all human beings creating this conflict. And Thucydides was a very realistic guy, and he believed human beings would never change. He thought that as long as there were human beings, there would be war. War would always exist as long as there were people. And unfortunately, he seems to have been proven right. If you look at the world today, people have not changed. Our technology has changed. Our knowledge, our level of knowledge about certain things has changed. Our culture has changed in quite a few ways. But we are all still human beings, just as we were at this time. We might have more knowledge, but we are no smarter. And yeah, we still have wars. We still make the same mistakes. We still do the same things. And this is a fascinating look at that ancient conflict, the Peloponnesian War. He was unable to finish, though. He passed away before he could finish his history. So the last part of the Peloponnesian War is not told in this history. But Xenophon took over. Xenophon was also Athenian, who had a lot of respect for Thucydides. And he took over the history, which you could find in Xenophon's Hellenica, which is not as often read as most of the other ancient Greek historians. And I think I think Penguin has an edition, but Penguin has retitled it. I think they retitled it, what was it? A History of My Times or something like that by Xenophon instead of the Hellenica. I'm not sure why that was done. I don't even know if Oxford has an edition of the Hellenica. I'll have to check. But this is a great edition of it. Xenophon is often criticized for not being as scrupulous an historian as Thucydides was. That is certainly true. And there are different accounts of the different events that happened at this period in time. And there is another historian actually in this volume that's included. Some fragments from a different historian. Let me see if I could find that in here. Yeah, this volume also has selections from the histories of Diodorus Siculus, which are relevant to Xenophon's Hellenica, and selected fragments of the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, relevant to Xenophon's Hellenica. So you have some different historians' views on certain events that are depicted in this history that might not be depicted so accurately by Xenophon, but still tremendously important book. There are things that we wouldn't know at all if we didn't have this continuation of of Thucydides' history. And it starts off right where this leaves off. And fortunately, we do have this wonderful landmark volume of it. But that's not all the Xenophon I'm going to be reading, because I also will be reading Xenophon's Anabasis. Usually when people read Xenophon nowadays, it's going to be the Anabasis that they read, which is the March of the 10,000. This tells the story of some Greek mercenaries who went into Persia to help a certain Persian become the king of Persia, a contender for the throne. And he is killed. And these Greek mercenaries are stranded in Persia and have to march back to the coast so that they could sail home, all the while besieged by various enemies and dangers and all kinds of trouble. They have a rough march home, to say the least. It is fascinating and entertaining. And Xenophon was one of that. He was one of the 10,000. He was one of the commanders. And so this is a firsthand account of this march and this experience. And so it's a fascinating read. Xenophon wrote a few different books besides these, but these are the most relevant to what I'm doing. And this is just, you can't not read this. And again, full of maps, every place that's mentioned here. You have maps, you have a lot of illustrations and photographs relevant to the text. And so this is going to be a lot of fun, revisiting Xenophon's Anabasis. This is great stuff. So this is the fourth history that I'll be reading, and that is going to be followed by Arrian's The Campaigns of Alexander. Now, Arrian lived long after the events that he's writing about, so he is distanced by time in a way the other Greek historians I'm talking about are not. They were all pretty close to what they were writing about, if not right in the thick of things. But that is not true of this work of history. But it's very, very important because Arrian used more contemporary sources in writing his history. He used sources that are now lost. So a lot of the information that we have about Alexander the Great and his invasion of Persia, a lot of the information we have from this history by Arrian. Arrian, who was a Greek, but he was also a soldier of Rome. Greece was part of the Roman Empire, of course. And so he was looking a ways back for this, but his research seemed to be sound. And like I said, very important history. and essential if you're interested in Alexander the Great, certainly. Again, we have a volume full of maps that'll tell you where everything happened in this history. It's fascinating stuff. Tons of notes for stuff you might not know. Bunch of information in the back of the book. These landmark histories are great. And so, yeah, going to be reading about Alexander the Great. But there is one historian that unfortunately is not part of the landmark series, at least not yet. And that is Polybius. So I will just hold up this copy of the Penguin Classics edition of Polybius. I have heard, I feel like I've been hearing this for 10 years, that there is a landmark edition being prepared of Polybius. It would have to be pretty long. But if that's true, that's great. I will celebrate the publication of a landmark Polybius. But until that happens, we're stuck with either the Penguin or the Oxford. I'm sure there are other editions of Polybius out there that are probably more complete. I don't know which edition I'm going to read. I might read the Oxford over the Penguin. The only edition of Polybius I've ever read is this one. This is not the entirety of Polybius. But what Polybius writes about is the rise of the Roman Empire. And so his histories has been titled in this Penguin edition, The Rise of the Roman Empire, because that was the main theme of what he was writing about. How did Rome, of all places, become such a great power? So powerful that they basically conquered all of these other nations. It's a fascinating story, and it's an interesting perspective. And Polybius is actually a really good writer. I'm not sure why I don't hear as much about Polybius as I do the other Greek historians, but I seem to hear less about Polybius. But he's tremendously important. And he is the last great ancient Greek historian as far as chronologically, the events that happened chronologically. This is the end of the Greek world as a free group of city-states. Then Rome takes over, and it's a great transitional point to leave the ancient Greek historians and move on to the ancient Romans, which I will. I'll be following this with Livy, who's also tremendously fun. But this is fascinating stuff, tremendously interesting, and essential if you're interested in this period of history. You have to read Polybius. It's excellent. It's a great read. Maybe one day that landmark edition will arrive, and that would be great, because the problem with Penguin editions is that they do not have enough maps, for one thing. Their maps are always tucked away in the back, so you always have to flip to the back. Very often the maps that they do use are not the greatest, as far as if you're actually trying to find something mentioned in the text. But for the moment, this is what we've got. So I probably will read the Oxford edition, if only because I haven't read it yet. But we'll see. We'll see when I get there. It'll be a while before I get to Polybius. But Polybius is the last great Greek historian on my list to read. And so, yeah, that's going to be fun. That's going to be fun. Roger, of course, can give me some firsthand information. He knew quite a few of these fellows, He got around, Roger did in his time. So that'll be fun. He can give us some commentary as I read this stuff. And I guess that's all I have to say today. I will catch you next time.